In this video, we're going to be taking a look at rendering in Viewport 2.0 inside of Maya to get a high quality look that is very similar to rendering inside of a game engine, but doing it all directly inside of Maya. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in Maya 2015. I wanted to make sure if you're going to follow along with the source content, you should have a folder that says Maya. And if you go in here, you should see there's source images for all the textures that were made, the actual scene file that we're taking a look at, this Viewport 2.0, and then the workspace, which should set up your project information. The source images have the actual Photoshop files that were used to make all the different textures, and within that source images area there's a TGA folder, which are the target files, which are the actual images that will be used on the actual model itself inside of Maya. So let's take a look at setting up our project real quick to make sure that all the textures should load for you. So before you actually open up your scene file, if you just open up Maya and you say File New and we get a new scene, something like that, we're going to go ahead and say Set Project. So you're going to have to navigate to wherever it is that you've put this information. So I'm going to go to where I actually have it stored. So here's where you'll see your root for Maya. So you can actually just click Maya and say set, and that's going to set the project, which should find that workspace file that we've set in there, and then it should path the different textures for you. So now when you go to File, Open Scene, and if you go to Workspace Root, I've got a lot of other files that I'm working on, but the only thing that you should see is this Viewport 2.0 Organic Hard Surface example. And then you go ahead and open that, and it should just load the file for you at that point. And the textures should be pathed for you. And the off chance that the textures are just not pathed for you correctly, you can fix some of those things. Maya actually has some built-in tools for fixing different pathing of different things within the scene. So you can go to Window and go to General Editors and go to File Path Editor and open that up, and you can see that if there will be an X next to anything that has textures that aren't pathed correctly, and you would be able to select those texture paths, and then you would be able to fix the path for like one file and it would resolve everything else. So that's just on the off case that this workspace doesn't pick up the location, which it should, but just in case it doesn't, that's how you can go ahead and fix that. So the first major thing that we're going to talk about is actually just turning Viewport 2.0 on. So I'm using Maya 2015. They've made Maya Viewport 2.0 the default renderer. So if you go under Renderer up here in the Viewport, you can see now Viewport 2.0 is the default renderer that will be automatically selected when you open up the program. They do have access to the legacy default viewport and high quality viewport if you need that. And that's mainly to support older files, but moving forward this is going to be the new standard for this. The other thing to note is that I think the first time you start up Maya, it will be displaying Viewport 2.0 in OpenGL draw mode, which is just a method of how they draw their graphics. We want to actually use the DirectX 11, which will give us all these nice bells and whistles for the latest shaders and things like that. So let's take a look at how we can go ahead and change that. So we're going to go to Windows, and we're going to go to Settings and Preferences, and then we're going to go to Preferences. And we're going to load that up and take a look, and we're going to go under Display. If we drag down to the bottom down here, you can see you can actually set what the default viewport is. So in our case it's Viewport 2.0, and this rendering engine, if this is the first time you've set any of this, will probably be on OpenGL. So you're going to want to change this to DirectX 11 and go ahead and hit save. The first time you change this, it's going to tell you that you're going to need to restart Maya. So if you need to restart Maya, go ahead and do that. And the next time you load up, Maya will be in the DirectX 11 mode. Okay, so go ahead and do that. Make sure that's turned on. The next thing that we're going to take a look at for the rendering settings for Viewport 2.0, you can go to the option box here for this, and let me just go ahead and drag this window over, is that we've got some cool different options for transparency, sorting, things like that. You'll just have to kind of play around with that a little bit. this light limit, how many lights the viewport can actually see, which is set to 8, which is pretty good. We're going to be looking at DirectX 11 shaders, which can only really see 3 lights, so this doesn't really help us in the case that we've got a DirectX 11 shader. So for our intents and purposes, this could just be 3, but we'll go ahead and leave it on 8 for this. You could clamp texture resolutions to be 4096 if you wanted to make sure your texture resolutions aren't too high, but I haven't gone any higher than that for mine, so I don't think I have to worry about that. The other thing we're going to take a look at is this screen space ambient occlusion, which you can see if you just turn this thing on and off and enable it with the samples of 16, which should give you some decent performance and give you a nice quality look. It just adds a little bit of contact shadow between different objects that are really close to each other. AO generally takes a long time to render in software, but this is just a kind of a visual trick based off of your screen space, like what you're looking at. So it's not rendering it quite the same way, I believe, as software render, but it has a nice look to it. So that's how you can turn that on and off. The other thing I want to make sure we have turned on is anti-aliasing. So we want to smooth all of our wireframes. If we had our grid turned on right here with this, you can see if we turn this anti-aliasing off, this is kind of the quality we get. We get these kind of jaggies and everything's kind of a little bit more rough. So we'll turn on smooth wireframe and multi-sample anti-aliasing, and I leave the sample count up to 8. So if you're going to use this setup every single time that you use Maya, it is possible that you can make a preset for this. So you can say save settings as preset, and you can give it a name. So I'll just call this Nick Z viewport 2.0, like that, and save preset. So the next time you come into Maya, you can just go to presets and say load, and you should see that as an option for you to load up. So you can make as many different combinations of presets as you want, but it's pretty easy to get that set up. The next big topic I want to talk to you guys about is cameras. So we're going to take a look at making sure we've got a camera, perspective camera, that we can use just for working and moving around our model, but then we're also going to have another perspective camera that is on a specific kind of track for rotating around our model. So the model itself doesn't rotate, it actually just stays still. It's actually our camera that's rotating around the model. And I'm going to show you how to make an empty group inside of Maya, and then we're going to parent our camera to that, and we're going to rotate that empty group and make that group turn, which in turn, because the camera is parented to it, will make the camera turn. And we can also have some controls for the camera, so we can kind of maybe zoom in and zoom out and change some different position on it. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So I like to use the outliner, so we're going to go to Window, and we're going to go to Outliner. And you can see I like to group everything with these groups here, right? So if I took any of my cameras and I just hit Control G, I would be able to group that thing like that, and you can give it a name if you want. So that's basically how I set up the hierarchy for this this empty group with perspective camera. So this is just the default perspective camera, and I hit Control G on it after I had kind of a position set up for the camera, and this gives me this empty group that we can start working with, and we can take and we can actually animate on this. So not exactly sure why I did this, but I gave myself 900 frames for this. I could have gave myself something like 720 for some even numbers for rotating around, you know, 360 degrees, and you can multiply that by 2. It's going to give you the 720. But I chose 900 frames, and so that's what we got. So basically, after I had the camera positioned somewhere like this and made that empty group, all you have to do is come over here and set your timeline to the first part in here. So you can just click and drag all the way to the left. And with this empty group that you've got here, you can select like the bottom of the stack here, click on the Rotate Z, and then hold down Shift all the way up to Translate Z and click that. Now if you right click on here, you can say Key Selected. So if we keyed that, you can see it turns red like this. It gives us a keyframe and everything's set to 0. And I want those same settings for the very end of my animation too, so I just drag left mouse drag all the way to the right, and I would change this to 360 and rotate Y. And that's going to make it rotate around in this kind of direction like that. So I set this to 360 and then do the same thing. We can either select from the bottom to the top, or we can go from the top to the bottom. Doesn't matter, but you just select the top, hold down shift click this, and then right click and say key selected, and that gives us this keyframe for a nice smooth animation on here. Now, one thing I do want you to kind of pay attention to is that this animation has ease in and ease out. Maya takes its curves and it actually builds ease in and ease out for the curves. So it kind of starts off a little bit slow for the rotation, then as it gets towards the end, it kind of slows down a little bit again as well. So I actually like that kind of look, because I want it to kind of feel as if it's taking a pause at this this nice view that we've got right here. So that's possible for us, but if you want to change that behavior, that's possible as well. So we could go to Window and go to Animation Editors and go to the Graph Editor, and then we could take a look at the curves that are actually generated for this. So I'm just holding down Alt and middle mouse dragging if I want to move this thing around, and you can hold down Alt and first mouse button, middle mouse button to kind of zoom in and out. And that's how you can kind of look at this stuff. So you can see here this rotate Y is where we actually set some keyframes on there. So if I just select just that, you can just isolate just that track that you're kind of looking for. And if we select the curves on there like this, just click and drag over it, we could change these curve types to linear. So let's just drag this over here and change this from our tangents from what it's set, which is spline. Actually, maybe it's set to flat. So I think it's set to flat originally, and we'll just change that thing to be linear. So now whenever we rotate this, you should see it should just be the same exact speed all the way through. You can see this is our timeline moving through this thing. So this just gives us a nice even motion all the way through the duration of what it is that we're playing. The reason it was kind of doing that different timing before, you saw it was kind of flat here, which takes a while for it to build up, and then it gets the speed, and the curve is almost straight through here, and then it comes back and tapers off. So the reason it's kind of ease in and ease out on that is because of that shape of that curve. So it's just depending on how you want this thing to flow, you're going to set it these different ways. So if you want it how I originally had it, we would just go to tangent, and I could say flat for this, and it just makes these curves flat here and here. And so you can see it does that nice ease in and then ease out for that. So that's how we get the camera to actually rotate. I want to show you this. So this is the rotation of the camera, but you can see through the animation of this thing, it doesn't just stay stationary in one spot, it kind of zooms in a little bit. So what I did was actually let the camera rotate to where it was kind of around in this position, and I guess I'm at about 450 for this, and I just took the camera and I changed its position just by how we normally navigate. And I think I just kind of zoomed in on the back area a little bit and kind of framed this thing up. And then I set a keyframe here. But before you set the middle keyframe, it is important that you get that initial position that you want and set a key at the beginning. And we do that just like we did for the rotation. So we just select this, right click, and say key selected. And we do that at the front, and we do that at the back. So then that way we've got matching keyframes from the beginning of the animation and the back end of the animation. And then after that's set, then we can set that keyframe in the middle here. And that gives us this nice kind of flow to where it kind of gives us a little bit more detail maybe on the back. I thought the back kind of looked cool, and I wanted to show that off. So that's how that camera motion happens. I'm not really doing anything much more than that. I think if you get a bit too crazy with your cameras, it could be a little bit jarring for the viewer. So you want to be kind of careful how much animation you actually introduce to your your camera whenever you're trying to show off your work. And if you wanted to play it really safe, you probably wouldn't even want to animate your camera kind of doing the zoom in part like what I've got. Just a nice rotation just to show off your model would be good as well. Okay, so I'm going to rewind this back. So this is basically how the animation part of the camera works. The other things I want to tell you about is how we can turn on and off a resolution gate that you see here. So if you hover your cursor above here, we've got this resolution gate which we can turn on and off, and we can also turn on and off this, they're calling it a gate mask, and you can actually control the color. I've made the color of mine darker. The default is a mid kind of gray kind of color. So let me get my outliner over here and I can show you how we can start to tweak some of these different values for this. So if we select our camera and hit Control A and bring up the attribute editor for our camera, there's some different things that we can set with our camera. The first thing I'm going to tell you about is under environment we can change our background color. Mine's set to white, and we'll take a look at rendering out some different passes a little bit later. So that's why it's set to white. The default should be black, and you're not going to see any kind of change because I've created on here an image plane. I actually have mapped to my background this nice kind of blue gradient that is a radial gradient. Is actually just a texture. Since I'm rendering out twice the resolution of 1920 by 1080, I was able to build a background piece inside of Photoshop that has a nice little gradient on there. And all you have to do is just click this create button, and it'll create a background plate for you that you could put an image back there if you want. And then you just need to it'll make this image plane shape, and from here it'll give you something that you can actually plug in what is the actual image that you want to use for this. This is actually going to be a little side note on how I built that sunburst for the background that you see inside of my Viewport 2.0 in the background. So it's basically just, if we go to image size, you can see that this image is 1920 by 1080. I know that's going to be my final target resolution that I'm going for in After Effects when I render this thing out. So I just made it that size that you see here for a new document, and then just used a gradient tool. So let's tap G and then make sure we're on this gradient tool, and we've got this gradient type here, and just make the background black, and you can put it on this option here, and you can see you can drag out little gradients like this from the center. If you hit Control R, it's real easy for you to take out a ruler and drag it down, and it should snap to the center of your document, and you can drag another one out and drag it this way and snap as well. And once we have that image saved out as a target file, let's go ahead and hop back on over to Maya, and we'll take a look at this camera, and you can see if we hit this image plane and hit create, it's going to actually make the image plane, and then we can pull in that image that we just saved out. And the thing that I want to show you about this color of this thing is we've got this color gain, and we can actually change the color of this. So if I wanted to make this like a reddish kind of color, it's real easy for you to be able to do that through this color gain under the actual image that you see here with this thing. I'm going to undo to get it back to the blue color that I had. I just wanted a little bit of lightness behind the character because my background is pretty black, and I've got some cool stuff for glowing elements, so I wanted there to be nice contrast between that, but just wanted to still be able to see a little bit of the silhouette, so that's why I put that little sunburst back there. But that's how you can quickly make an image that's just black and white, make that inside of Photoshop, bring it in here, and use that as your background, and still be able to tweak some of the color values and things like that. So it's pretty easy to set that up if you wanted to make something like that. I could put this to none, and then I can kind of show you what would happen with the background color at that point. Currently the background color is set to white. It is possible in Maya you can hit Alt and B and cycle through these different colors that you have within inside of the background. So I would be using something like this. Another way to change colors is if you go to setting preferences and then go to color settings. There's actually under 3D view, you can see that there's a background color, and we can change that to be white as well there, or you can change it to be black. This thing that we've got for the let me move this over so I can show you all the different options for this. What we've got this color for this background is actually whenever we go to render with our cameras, and we open this up for a render view, when we go to render, this color right here in the camera settings is actually what is going to control what the color of the background is when we render. Okay, so you can see this is making a white background for us at this point. So it's a little bit tricky to kind of understand like what's going on in the background and just the viewport. That color can come from here. You can see this gradient top and bottom. Remember, if we hit Alt B, you can cycle between this gradient, a black background, this gray background color, and I want this set to white. And if I say save for this, this should give me this. It's supposed to save the colors for us. I actually believe that that is a bug, because you can see here the color set to white, but it's just not holding for whatever reason. So I do believe that is a bug, why it's not going pure white at that point. So I'll just cycle this back to black or a gradient, because that's a little bit distractive. I'm going to hit Control A after I select my camera and then go back to this image plane here and turn this back on to RGB to get this back on here. Okay, so that's how we can set up a background plate for that. I didn't show you how to change the actual gate mask color, which we've got turned on. So I believe that's under, let's see here, yeah, under display options, this gate mask color, you could have this set to white or whatever, and you can see there's an opacity associated with it. Let's move this stuff over so you can kind of get an idea what's going on. This gate mask really helps you understand this area is live here. So whenever you do an actual render, this is what's going to be rendered out here. And it kind of masks off the rest of Maya's viewport, just so it's really clear what you're going to get when you render. And you can change that color to anything you want. You know, if you want it to be this obnoxious kind of red color, you can do that. And you can see this opacity here controls how opaque this actually is. So you can lessen that up. But I'll just leave it at the default 0.7, and I'll change the color to like a darker kind of gray, like that. So that's the gate mask, turning that on and off. Let's take a look real quick at our render settings so you can understand how to set this resolution here. So we're going to go up here in this area and click this little icon to turn on our render settings. And you can see under common, we've got render using, we're going to be rendering with Maya Hardware 2.0, which is Maya Viewport 2.0, but we can actually do some batch rendering with that, and we're going to take a look at that. I'm going to change my image format type. I'm just going to make sure that's set to TIFF. I like to use target files, but I've seen that that can cause some issues. I'm going to turn this on from single frame to name.number.extension, and that will give you an idea up here. You can see what it's going to be kind of called. So it'll be whatever the name of your scene file might be, or this file name prefix if you add that here, and then .001 or 2 or 13 or whatever, and then .tiff. I've noticed I want to pull this into After Effects, and I've just have found that it plays nice with this kind of order that we've got set here. Frame padding gives like 4 numbers here, and then it gives this number right here at the end. This ensures that whenever you look at your files, like in Windows, it will actually order them correctly. If you don't have the right amount of padding for your numbers, it might kind of get things jumbled up a little bit. So just go ahead and give that a frame padding of 4, and you should be just fine for that. Frame range. This is how much of the animation you're actually going to render. So my animation starts at frame 1 and ends at frame 900, like that. So I will do that, but when we get into rendering, I don't want to render that many frames, so I'm just going to put it to 10 for my end frame. So now it's going to render frame 1 through 10. Okay, and here's my renderable cameras. If you the only thing I really want it to render is this perspective camera. If you see anything else on there, you can disable the cameras that are going to be rendering on there. Here's my image size, which is set to custom, and actually all I did was take 1920 by 1080 and multiply those numbers by 2 to get this 3840 by a height of 2160. The reason I'm doing that is because when we render in Maya Viewport 2.0, even though we have anti-aliasing turned on, you can see there's a little bit of jaggies along some of these edges. And if I render it up twice the resolution and then scale that thing down inside of After Effects, I'll get some free anti-aliasing whenever I do that. So that's why I'm rendering it twice the size of what I actually need. Obviously it's going to make your file sizes a lot larger, but we're just doing a turntable, and then we're considering this for portfolio work. So we want the quality to look the best that it possibly can look. So don't be afraid to render this thing over the size of what you actually need. Okay, so this is going to give us this approximation of the screen size that we have inside of the program here. And this is really as far as I want to get in depth with the cameras for this section. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about lighting. In order for us to take a look at lighting, I'm going to make a camera that we can use just for working with. So I've named mine Perspective Working Camera. It's pretty easy to make a new camera that you can use for just kind of looking around. Just go to Panels, Perspective, and just say New, and it's going to make a new camera for you that you can see here. And then you can use that camera and navigate around. So that's basically what I did to get this Perspective Working Camera that you see here. And you can just go ahead and middle mouse drag any camera that you want to look at. You can middle mouse drag into the scene, and you're then working with that particular camera. Okay, so I'm going to go under Show, and currently I have cameras turned off and I have lights turned off. So if you have everything turned on, this is probably what you should be looking at. So you can see here, here's the camera that we had that's actually animating around. So visually, if you wanted to kind of see that, you could see that thing actually animating around in a different camera. Okay, so here's the lights, and I'm just going to do a really simple lighting setup. Like I was saying earlier, the DirectX 11 shaders only pick up currently 3 different lights. So I'm going to use a main light and 2 bounce lights. I'm going to do a bounce light that's kind of the direction away from the main light here, and then I've got this other fill light that's just kind of slight in the back to kind of highlight some of the different pieces that I've got back here. So to create the lights, it's pretty simple. We're just going to go to Create, and then we go to Lights, and then I'm actually using a spotlight. And with anything in Maya, you see this little box here. That's your option box that you can click and load up, and you can see the creation options for things. So I've got a cone angle of 40, and a penumbula angle is set to 0, which I could set that to something like 20, and you'd want it to cast shadows like that. Now I know in Viewport 2.0, a lot of times I want to crank the lighting value a bit higher, so you might want to push that to 1.25 or so. But just to create the light, you can create it. You can give it a color too if you wanted. I would just leave it at white for now. So go ahead and hit Create. That's going to create your light for you, and this will create the spotlight. So I'm going to select the light that I have, and I've taken all the lights I've got, and remember, if you hit Control G, you can actually group these different pieces together and then name that group. And I've just named mine lights, so I just make it really easy in the outliner for me to kind of identify, here's my cameras, lights, geometry, and maybe texturing, stuff like that. So let's take a look at some of the settings for this actual light. And we can actually look through the light directly inside of the viewport. So you can select the light and you could say panels look through selected. That's one way, or you could middle mouse drag this into the viewport and you're actually looking through it. So remember when we created this light, I'm going to Control A, we set up a cone angle of 20, which is this inner radius, and then this penumbra angle, which is 20, which gives us this thickness here. And this penumbra angle is basically saying a fall off for the light. So anything outside of here starts to get almost pure black at that point. So this is 100% light, falls off from 100% light all the way over to 0. So it gives you a nice kind of fade and fall off for your light here. You can see I've actually cranked my intensity to 2.5 for the lighting on this, and I've turned on shadows. So if we go to shadows, we actually saw that with the creation option to turn that on, but if you want to turn this on or off later, you can do this with depth map shadows. So you're going to go ahead and turn that on. I have my resolution set to 2048, and this filter size is really important. This is going to make your shadows feel a bit softer, so always crank that up. The only way currently in 2015 to get really soft shadows is you have to drop your resolution of your shadow down to something like 512. So I'd use numbers like 512, 1024, 2048, 4096 for shadow resolutions. So I found that this 2048 gives me some pretty nice resolution on the shadow, and it seems soft enough. I'd like it a little bit softer, but the controls just aren't in there yet. So that's kind of the basic setup for the shadows. I'm going to go put this back into panels, perspective, and go to my working camera. And then I want to make sure that you also know that under lighting, you need to make sure that this shadows is turned on to actually see your shadows. Okay? And we also need to know something about how we're displaying our models. So if we hit 4, that's going to be our wireframe, and my wireframe color is actually black right now, so that's not going to be beneficial for us on a black background. I'll tap Alt B and you can see that now. 5 is going to be just shaded mode, like this, and you can see we're turning some of these options basically on up here. 6 is going to be textured, and it might take a little bit for that to load. And then 7 is going to be lighting with textures and shading on that. So I'll tap Alt B to get my background back to this thing that we saw here. And so basically that is how we're going to get our light set up, our main light, the color for it, making sure we've got shadows turned on. And then we want to start making some point lights to have for some fill. So it's the same thing. We just go to create lights and then go to point light. You could use the option box for that, but I usually just create those and kind of tweak them after the fact. So you can see I'm kind of putting it away from the main light here. And the other thing I'm doing with these lights, I'm setting their decay rate. Mine is set to quadratic, which if you just have it on no decay, you can see it just pushes the light and it goes off into infinity and would keep lighting this scene. Even if you had things way back here, it would light it. But if you put it on linear and quadratic, these have different fall off rates. So this light has an intensity around it, and it kind of falls off rather quickly with quadratic. You can control that through the intensity. So if I have my intensity set to like 50, you can see this kind of nice fall off that I get over here. But I just want just a little bit of light down here, so that's why I set this to 3. So it is hitting right down here and kind of picking up just a little bit of kind of bounce down here, but I didn't want it very strong. So it's kind of up to you to kind of play around with those values for your lights and what you want to kind of set for that. And then I've got another light that's back here towards the back of the character that's just kind of giving a little bit of blue light back in this area to kind of illuminate kind of this area. Now I want this to be pretty black in through here. The reason I'm doing that is because I want these nice glow effects to kind of show up, right? So that's why I've kind of set up this lighting for myself here. I want this nice dark shading away from that main light. So depending on that look that you're going for, you might want to just, play with these different values of how big is the cone angle of this light here and the fall off of it, and how intense are these two little bounce lights that you've got here. And you should be able to get some halfway decent illumination across your model with just those three different lights. But I wanted a little bit more dramatic kind of look for my lighting, so that's why I set things up the way that I did. Okay, the other thing to note is I don't have any animation on my lights, but it is possible that you can actually animate any of these values that we saw over here. And you would do it the same way that we did the camera. So you can just right click, like say on intensity, you could right click on that and say key selected, and you could change the intensity of the light over time, and you could actually even change the color of the light over time as well. So it's possible that you could animate those elements if you want. I would say for portfolio pieces, again, this is another area where I don't think you want to get too crazy with things. Okay, so there's a nice little look at lighting. So let's talk a little bit about shaders. So with Viewport 2.0, it's possible that you can just use any of Maya's default shaders that you have in here. So I'm using a lot of blend shaders, which gives you a nice kind of metal kind of highlight kind of feel. You can use Lambert's surface shaders. They're really doing a good job of making sure that all of Maya's base materials works inside of Viewport 2.0. They've also given this DirectX 11 Uber shader, and we'll take a look at that as well. But that's a little bit different. You do have to make sure that you're in this DirectX 11 mode for the Uber shader. We've already turned that on, so that shouldn't be a big deal. But you also might need to make sure that you have some plugins loaded for that. So you can see here in the plugins manager, I have the DirectX 11 shader.mll loaded. So we've got that loaded, and it's set to auto load as well. Let me drag this over just a little bit. And basically, to get this open, we just go to Window, Setting Preferences, and then go to the Plugins Manager, and that's going to open this thing up. And just drag down a little bit, down until you see the DirectX 11 shader.mll. To make sure that that's loaded. It should be loaded by default, but just in case, you can go ahead and load that thing up and make sure that it auto loads. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about transparency inside the viewport. So I'm going to select this object, hit Control A, and this is the blend material that I set up for it. So let's open up also the window rendering editors and open up the hypershade. So this is where you should be doing the bulk of your work for your shaders. Here's all the shaders that I have inside of my scene, and you should see over here Maya, and we can go ahead and just click on blend, and you can middle mouse drag that over into the work area. That's one way of creating it, and hit undo, or you can just click blend, and you can see it's going to make this new blend for you at that point. So if you assign that to something, you can just middle mouse drag it onto the object, or you can have the object selected, right click on it and say assign material to selection, like that. And here's where we can start to control things, right? So we can change the color of it if we wanted to make this thing red, like what I kind of had here. We can control the transparency, like we've got. If you don't want to see this thing selected with the geo, you can say select while you're working with the material, and now you just have the actual material selected. Okay, so we can crank that up for the transparency. The other thing we can do is take either ambient color and pull that up, and you can see it feels like it's self-illuminated, or we can work with incandescence. So if I put this to red, you can see it's still semi-transparent, but it has this feeling that it's kind of glowing through it, like that. Okay, so there's that. Diffuse, if you pull that thing down, normally if we don't have this incandescence on, and we'll take the transparency down a little bit, this diffuse actually controls the darkness or the shading lightness or darkness of things, and I think that's normally set to 0.8 for most objects like that. There are things that you could play around with translucence and the translucence depth when you're dealing with some transparency. Also this specular color, if you wanted to make this hotter or kind of lessen that value, you can play with that slider. Eccentricity, we can pull that to make the highlight tighter. So if you want something like a glass surface, your highlight is going to be pretty small. Pushing to something like plastic or something is going to be a little bit larger. And if you want a really nice soft fall off, you can make it really large and then start pulling down the actual specular color and lessen that up. And maybe pull that down just a little bit like that. You also are able to play around with this specular roll off and change the how intense that kind of builds up on there. The thing I really love about doing this stuff in real time is you just get this feedback instantaneously, right? And you get to see exactly what it is that you're setting, and you can kind of play around with the values a bit to get it to where you want it to be. Okay, so the other thing we'll talk about is reflectivity. So you're not going to see any kind of change on here unless we have some kind of map associated with that. So texture-wise, I've got this reflection environment file, which is just a picture of sky with the ground here. And basically, we could just try this out. We'll try to middle mouse drag that onto reflected color. And you'll see it does reflect for us, but it's not really behaving the way that I would like. So I'm just going to right click on here and say break connection. And really what we could do is we could map this, click that map button there, and there's a place for environment textures where we can use this thing called an environment ball. And we click that and it basically takes that image and kind of maps it to a sphere kind of object, and then it reflects into that surface through this environment ball. So I think that gives a better effect. I've already got one of these set up that I'm using for all the reflections in here, so I'll double click on that and you can see, once you have the environment ball, you can put any image you want into there and just map it to that area. So I've got that mapped there. So let's select this object again, hit Control A to bring up the attribute editor. I'll select it, and then now I can take this environment ball, click and drag it into the reflected color, and now you can see how it kind of rolls around for the reflectivity at that point. Now you may have noticed when you put this reflective texture on here, it does some things to the shading, right? So it looks quite a bit lighter than what it did before. So it might be possible to kind of play around with some of these diffuse values, and you might have to go through and readjust some of the color values that you're kind of working with at that point as well. Maybe transparency. I mean, it is interesting that you can actually mix color in with your transparency, and that has an effect on things as well. But I think for the most part you could just leave that gray, but you can see it does have some effect on the overall color on this thing. We want it more transparent, like that. Okay, so there's a bit of ways that we can sit there and control some of the values on this and get some interesting different kind of effects. Now I do want to show you how we can set up reflectivity or transparency in a way that would be something where it could be more reflective or opaque around the edges, and then it's more transparent on the inner parts. So we've got this blend material that we just looked at, and if we graph the network on this so we can see all the connections that are going into it, you select it down here in the work area. So if you don't see it down here, you can just middle mouse drag it down, and we'll graph that. And you can see what's actually hooked to this thing currently. What I have here is this environment ball, and you can see connections here. It's actually feeding into the reflective color, so you can actually see kind of what's going on with these connections if you just hover your cursor over the top of that. So I'm going to build this thing that's called Fresnel, right? And that's going to give us some kind of value that's different around the edges that face away from the camera than the faces or the normals that are facing towards the camera. Okay, and for us to set this up, we want to come over here to Maya, make sure we're seeing all these different things here. We can go to Utilities, and then we are looking for a sample info node, which is right here. So we can just middle mouse drag this thing into the scene, over here in this work area, I'm sorry, not into the scene, right like that. And we want to control values with a ramp. We want to be able to build a ramp that tells us if it's going to be more opaque over here, it might be like a white color. If it's transparent here, it might be black. We'll look at what those values are. So we also need a ramp. So if we go to 2D textures, we can go to the ramp and click and drag that over here like that. And sorry, it's got this placement node associated with it. So I can move this over here. I actually should make this sample info move over here. So just select it and left mouse click. So we need to tie this sample info node into the ramp. So all we have to do is middle mouse drag on top of this while holding shift. So I hold down shift, click and middle mouse drag this onto here, and that's going to bring up the connection editor. And you can see that we drug this on top of this one. So it's saying the outputs of this, we want to use the facing ratio on this and tie it into the UV coordinates of this ramp. So we're just going to go click U and V chord. And to be honest, I don't know how this kind of voodoo magic is really working behind the scenes for this. I just know that I've used this technique for a long time, and it's pretty easy to get set up. This is really all we got to do is click this facing ratio and tie it into the U and V coordinates like that. And we're kind of done at that point as far as the little setup. Now we can double click on this and you can see now we can take this ramp and we can tie it to our transparency, and we can also tie it to our reflectivity amount as well. And you can see that kind of change at that point. So if we double click on our ramp and we take a look at the ramp that we have, currently it's just going from black to white. We can change the position of this ramp like this, or we could flip-flop the direction over here like this as well. So now you can kind of see what's going on here. It's more reflective and more transparent along the edges right now than it is on the inner part. So that's why we've got this dark shading over here like this. And if we pull this in over here, you can see how we can kind of really tweak that thing out at that point. We can also drag this black point and we can change that. So depending on the look that you're going for with this, you're going to be able to take these different points and change them. Now it is possible that you can have more than just 2 points. You just click in here and you'll have a new point to kind of work with, and you'll have a new selected color or value that you can work with as well. So we can drag that thing down and you can change the fall off of things at that point. I'm going to double click on this and I can tell that the specular amount that I've got on here is really making it very difficult to see inside of the thing. So I want it to feel kind of like glass, so I'm going to push that thing down quite a bit. Okay, like that. The other thing I want to make sure that you guys understand about these transparent objects and some of the shader stuff is that this thing is casting a shadow. So anytime you have this transparent object, you really probably don't want this thing casting a shadow. So we'll select the actual object, hit Control A to bring up the attribute editor for it, which we've already got this open with the shader here. But we'll go to the shape node. And if you open up render stats, you can see you can turn on and off shadows for that, and you can see how it changes the shading at that point. So make sure for your transparent objects you don't have cast shadows turned on. Okay, so that's kind of how I set up this thing here as far as the windshield goes. The difference is I'm going to get rid of all this. I'm actually going to get rid of that shader that we just made as well, and I'll put this back on this glass that I have here, and then I'll take this and I'll map this so we can see what we've got going on here. The only thing I've got really different about this is that I actually don't have this thing mapped with reflectivity. So I didn't put any reflection on there. You can put the reflection on there if you want. I basically have this ramp for some of the transparency things, but I also have this, what I'm calling an emissive map, which gives it this illusion that there's some self-illumination going on. And you can see that that's actually piped into the incandescence that we have here. If we zoom in on this map, you can see it's pretty light. The values don't have to be too strong with this stuff. Let's look at this in Photoshop and you'll see it's really kind of clear. So here we are inside of Photoshop, and you can see these values are pretty light on this, but this is enough to give that effect that we're looking for. So you're gonna maybe have to play around with the values just a bit to get that right kind of effect. So again, that's plugged into the incandescence, and then it gives this illusion that this thing has some kind of self-illumination going on. And that's basically what's been done with all the different glowing pieces on here. It's actually being driven by a map on here. Now the only thing that I've done that's a little bit different is on these tubes. Let's go ahead and look at those, and we'll graph the network on those. Let me graph that. And you can see I've got this map here that it's mapped to. Let's look at the UVs on this. So I'm going to go to Window UV Texture Editor and open that up. And let me pick the correct one for this. So we'll just take a look at the UVs. I'm not going to select the correct image for this, but basically the length of these tubes is running this way, like this. I do have it sitting outside of the 0 to 1 range, which is not that big of a deal, and I actually have a different material on these end pieces. So you could just imagine this texture right here, which is just kind of like these little scan lines and some other stuff right here, and it gets put over the entire duration of this this piece of the model here. Okay, so I just went ahead and changed it to the right image, so maybe it's going to make it a little bit more clear. So you got to imagine that this texture gets repeated past the 0 to 1 range that we've got here for our UV texture area. And I'm actually taking the place 2D node that goes into every single texture that Maya has. When you make a texture, it's actually going to give you this node. And you can see you can change the repeating and the tiling of that texture over that UV space that you've got here. So I've got it repeating 2 times, and I'm actually changing it to where it's a value less than 1, and it really kind of scales that up quite a bit. So it's changing the tiling rate of that. And I've also got this UV offset. So over the duration of the animation, I know I'm getting a lot of stuff on screen here, sorry about that, but I'm just trying to make sure you can see everything we've got. I don't think I necessarily need the UV texture editor window, but I'll close that thing and take a look at this. So basically this offset, we can change where that texture position is on the UVs. And so I've got this number animating a little bit different from the beginning, and then the center like this, and the end. So what I'm doing is this. I set a value for this at the very beginning. So I set this to something, we could put it like 2 or something. And then at frame 10 or 12, around there, I set another value for that to where it offsets it. So it just is basically moving this thing in an upward direction. If I go to the animation editor and go to the graph editor, you can see here's the values. Since I have this thing selected, it's going to show me what I've actually got animated here. And I only want to see the offset, really the offset V, like this. Okay. So basically these are the keyframes that I set. I set at frame 0 a stat, we could say 1.25 is what it's saying it is. And then at frame 12.5 it's a value of 2. So because it's moving from 1.25 to 2, it's actually like it's taking that texture and it's pushing it up. And because our UVs are laid out to where they're nice and straight, it's pushing that texture up, and it's looking like it's moving through that UV space. Okay, so I've actually set it to where I can have these curves go off into infinity and keep building on top of itself. So I only have to set a little animation for the frame 0, and then a set of animation point for frame 12. So I select the curves like this, and we can go to curves pre-infinity, and we can say cycle with offset, and post-infinity we can say cycle with offset as well. And then we can also view infinity. That's where we can just turn on and off the viewing of this. So if you don't have this enabled where you can actually view infinity, it's going to be a little bit tough to kind of see what's going on with this curve. Because I didn't want to set animation for this thing to move all the way through the timeline. I just wanted to make a little snippet of it, and then it basically takes this chunk and plays it again and puts it on here and keeps building. That's why we did that curves post infinity cycle with offset like that. So it gives us that piece that we're looking for, that it just kind of basically makes a curve that goes linear like that. And so that causes this thing to move throughout this. Now it does look like things change, right? So it gets, the texture actually gets smaller. So I've done some weird stuff with the scale on this. If I didn't have this keyframe at the beginning and at the end, then the scale would just look exactly kind of like it's just pushing through and it's really large like this. But I've changed the amount of repeat that you see here to 2 in this area, which if we look at the beginning of the animation, it's really small. It's less than 1. So that's why it's really big. The texture is really big on here at the beginning. And then towards the middle, it's tiling 2 times. So you get these smaller lines. And then I'm putting it back to 0.05 over here. So as you play that, it just starts off, the texture is really big, gets smaller, and then over time gets back to that larger thing. It's probably not as intuitive when you do this for the first time, because this smaller number for repeat actually makes the texture larger, and then the higher repeat number actually makes the texture look smaller on the object. It's just something that you're going to have to kind of get used to for tiling textures. Okay, the last thing that we're going to be taking a look at is rendering out our different frames. And we've already kind of touched on a little bit of some of the subjects that we need to know when we looked at our cameras. So we need to open up our render settings, and we've kind of looked at already the fact that we can change the output name to something, which you should probably make your name something. I'm using this image format of a TIFF, and we talked about our frame padding, making sure that we're using this name.number.extension so we can load that into Photoshop, or we can load it into After Effects pretty easily. We looked at the start frame and end frame, and I'm only at mine from 1 to 10 because I don't want to render out the duration of this thing. Making sure that we only have that one camera that we really want to render be renderable. And then setting up our resolution. I said that I'm using values that are twice as big as 1920 by 1080 because I want to get some free anti-aliasing whenever I scale that thing down, back down to 1920 by 1080 whenever I'm done. Okay, so that's basically getting things the right size and getting things set up for whenever you're going to render, right? If you want to check your render and just check single frames, it's possible that you can just come here and then you can go to just render. Sometimes I do a render snapshot just to make sure I'm on the right camera and everything. So you can go to render snapshot, and we could say perspective, because that's the camera that I'm going to be rendering. And then it usually just gives you this little snapshot of a wireframe and everything. That can help you before you do a long render, but since we're doing hardware 2.0, shouldn't be that big of a deal for us to render like that at that point. So from some previous renders, I've got this set up to where it's rendering the wireframe over the top of shaded. I'm going to show you where we change those options. So let's go back to our render settings, and you can see in the tab Maya Hardware 2.0, there's some rendering options down here. And here you can see we can change this render mode here. So we can just render out a wireframe if you wanted to render out a wireframe, which my current wireframe is actually black. And against that background, that doesn't work all that well. So I'm going to show you a setup to get some really nice clean lines out of this. So we've got wireframe mode. We could do shaded like this and just render it. You can see that this is going to give us this flat kind of gray shaded. We could do wire on shaded, which is what I just had, like that. And we could do default material. Just going to render everything gray with that default gray material. And we can do shaded on texture. And that's going to give us basically what we see exactly in our viewport. So that's basically like our beauty shot at that point. And then you can do wire on shaded if you wanted to do that as well. So that's possible. I'm not going to do bounding box, but so let's just look at shaded and texture. This is what we want to look at here. Normally, if I do 1:1, you can see this is really large. Normally in Maya, I'm not sure if this is a bug currently or not, but we could usually go to this test resolution and go drop it down to half so you see what it would look like at 1920 by 1080 and do another render. Yeah, so it keeps rendering it at the larger resolution. Normally whenever I'm doing software renders, that's not the case. So I do think that that's probably a bug currently with this version of Maya 2015, and I believe this is Service Pack 1. But that might be different in the future. But it could be possible for you to do smaller resolutions in the future if that is a bug and they do fix that. But you can zoom in and zoom out, just holding down Alt, first mouse button and middle mouse button together. You can drag those, and you can hold down Alt and middle mouse, and you can move that thing around. So you can kind of inspect the image that you're looking at. Okay, so this is the default kind of thing that we want. We want this beauty pass. But I was going to show you what if we want to have some really nice wireframe rendered out. Okay, so you might know about layers, and if you do, that's good. I'm going to show you we can change the color of our wireframe, right? So if we go to shading and say wireframe on shaded, you can see the wireframe over the top of our model shaded in the viewport, and sometimes that comes in really handy. Right now my color is black because I've set that with this over here in a layer. So basically I've taken all of my geometry and I made a layer over here with this button, which is create new layer with whatever is selected. And then if you double click on this, you can change the name of whatever this layer is over here. And you can also give it a color like this. So if I save this and say red, you can see now my wireframe is red. So we have the ability to change the color of our wireframe. I'm making it black because I'm going to render this in a way to where everything is pure white except for the wireframe, which is black. And the way that I'm doing that is through this. If we go to renderer over here, there's render layers. And if I take all my geometry that I want to render wireframes with, and I make a new layer based off of what I've got selected, it'll make this that we've got here. Okay, so I'm going to select it, and actually I'm using an override material. So it's possible with these render layers, which is really cool, that you can take everything on that layer and it'll assign it a special shader that you give. So my shader that I made, and let me open up the hyper shade for us so we can take a look at this. is this white surface shader, which is just going to give us pure color. So if I double click that, you can see this out color is set to white. So it's just going to be pure white and nothing else. There's going to be no other shading. It's pretty easy to make one of those shaders. You just come to the Maya area here and you can click surface shader, and that gives you this, and you can change the color to white. Once the shader is made, you can right click over here and you can say overrides, and you can say assign existing material override, and you can find that thing that you made. I called mine white surface shader. So that's what's assigned to it. So you can see now whenever I render like this, actually it's going to be the white background. It doesn't have the wireframe on there. It does have this ambient occlusion on there, and I'm missing my wireframe. So we can fix that, not a big deal. The reason the background is white, if you remember back looking at our cameras, we took our camera, hit Control A, and here's where this thing comes into play, where our environment, our background's set to white. Remember when we said that's going to cause this to render white back there. That's what we want. If you remember, we turned on screen space ambient occlusion. That is turned on all times through this here for the screen space ambient occlusion. We'll turn that off. Now when we render, it's going to be pure white. We need to get our wireframe back. So if you remember our render settings through here, at the bottom down here, we're going to do wireframe on shaded. Like that. Okay? So if we look here, it's going to be nice and clean for us, and it's just going to give us our wires. Now we can use this in After Effects or Photoshop. We could set this to multiply, or we could inverse this image. There's all kinds of different possibilities, because basically you've got a black and white image of your wireframe that you can do, and you can change that to different colors and things like that. Okay? So the other thing I wanted to show you is that it is possible for you to batch render these things out. So normally you would go to rendering. The thing that kind of threw me off about batch rendering with Hardware 2.0 is that if you go to rendering and say batch render and go to the options, there are no options for Hardware 2.0. I think this is a mistake on Autodesk's part, and I wish they would change this because it becomes very confusing. But basically you need to set all your render options through the render settings through here. So this is kind of, if you think about the option box, this is really the option box at that point. But if we go to render and just say batch render, it should go through and render those frames for us. If you remember, I set my frame range to be 1 through 10 through here. So it's going to render those out, only those 10 frames. But I would suggest you do a few tests and make sure everything's kind of set up correctly with just a few frames. And once you know that that's working, then it's time to go ahead and set that up for the full duration. Now the cool thing about rendering with Viewport 2.0, in my opinion, is the speed factor. So you get a pretty good look out of it, and it renders really, really quick. So even if some things kind of go wrong here or there, if you got to do a little change of values or whatever, it's pretty easy to re-render those things out really quickly. Okay, so that's a pretty good overview of how we can use Viewport 2.0 inside of Maya. Set up a turntable, set up some lighting, set up some emissive things on our shaders, looking at Fresnel, how we can render out just beauty shots, and then render out wireframes, and then actually even batch render that stuff. And then we can take that information and pull that into either Photoshop to do compositions, or we can take that into After Effects to build up our final portfolio piece.